I thought I'd seen it all after living on my family's farm for 6 decades. Tornadoes ripping off barn roofs, coyotes prowling our chicken coops, even an escaped circus llama once traipsing across our fields. But nothing prepared me for the day. I noticed white tents sprouting up like mushrooms behind my hayfield, chairs lined in neat rows, and flower arches blazing with ribbons. It was as if a traveling carnival had arrived overnight. Except this was no carnival. It was a wedding. And apparently, I was the last to know. I first spotted the commotion on a Wednesday morning when I drove my tractor to check the irrigation ditch. The farm is on a quiet road that runs behind our local HOA community, a mere stone's throw from a cluster of meticulously manicured suburban homes. These folks rarely ventured onto my property, which suited me fine. We had an unspoken understanding that my goats braying at dawn and my roosters crowing at odd hours were part of rural living. In return, I kept to myself and occasionally sold eggs, honey, or fresh produce at a small roadside stand. Peaceful coexistence, plain and simple. So, you can imagine my shock as I climbed off my tractor and caught a glimpse of an aisle runner billowing in the breeze. Rows of pristine white chairs flanked either side, and a decorative archway glimmered with lace ribbons. Yellow daisies, pink roses, and baby's breath swirled in intricate patterns, all meticulously woven with greenery. It looked downright professional, like something out of a high-end venue brochure. But this wasn't any venue. This was my land, and nobody had asked for my permission. At first, I questioned my own memory. Had I, in some delirious senior moment, agreed to rent out a portion of my farm for an event? I knew I'd recently turned down a request to host a local church picnic. They wanted to plop a bouncy castle in my cornfield. But a wedding? Not a chance. Shaking off the initial confusion, I trudged closer. A banner fluttered in the breeze, proclaiming, "Congratulations, Meredith and Charles." That's when I noticed her, the woman many of us privately nicknamed HOA Karen. She was hobbling around on dangerously high heels, barking orders at a small group of younger people who looked like reluctant volunteers. Karen wore an expression of satisfaction, so smug you could have bottled it and sold it as perfume. This was the same woman who'd once threatened me with a city ordinance violation because my organic fertilizer apparently smelled too strong for her morning jog. From all the stories circulated among neighbors, she was the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association, gatekeeper of all that was nice and proper. And now, apparently, she had decided to adopt my farm as her personal wedding venue. I cleared my throat loudly as I approached. Karen glanced over, frowned, and then forced her face into a cheerful grin that looked about as natural as plastic garden gnomes. "Oh, hello," she called, waving a manicured hand with zero sincerity. "I see you found us." "Us?" I echoed, crossing my arms. "More like I found a wedding where it doesn't belong." Karen gave a dismissive laugh. "Oh, you must be confused. I sent out an email a week ago. We're hosting a small ceremony here, just for a few hours on Saturday. The bride is my niece. It's going to be lovely." I stared at her, trying to decide if she was clueless, entitled, or both. "You did what now?" She rolled her eyes. "I emailed you." "Well, not you directly. I emailed the extension office that deals with local farms. I assumed the message would get passed along to the relevant parties. If you didn't get it, that's not my fault. Besides, I have permission from the city to hold a gathering near the lake." That was a half-truth, if I'd ever heard one. My farm sits adjacent to a man-made lake that the city stocks with fish. However, the property line is extremely clear. The public can enjoy a small portion of the shoreline. But everything else, including the wide field currently filled with wedding decor, is privately owned, my farmland. Any event at that scale would require official approvals, paperwork, and most importantly, my explicit consent. None of that had happened. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Karen, you're on my land," I said evenly, gesturing with my work gloves toward the dais and archway. "I didn't authorize any wedding. You can't just set up tents and invite guests onto my property without permission." She sniffed and flicked invisible dust off her shoulder. "We're almost finished setting up, and it's only for a day. It's for family. You wouldn't want to spoil a bride's special moment, would you?" I felt my jaw tighten. The last thing I wanted was a feud, but this was an outrageous intrusion. Still, the thought of an angry bride, tearful and humiliated, tugged at me. My own daughter had gotten married on this farm years back, and I knew how delicate emotions ran around such occasions. But letting them walk all over me? That didn't sit right either. I forced a stiff nod. I'll be in touch shortly. Don't do anything else without talking to me first. I whirled around and trudged back toward the house. My mind was spinning, toggling between fury and bemusement. So much for quiet days. The date was Wednesday, meaning this special day was just 3 days away. I had no illusions that Karen would pack up and retreat. She had probably invested in planners, florists, and a small army of relatives. Stopping this now would be like trying to wrangle a runaway bull with a piece of dental floss. But I'd be darned if I let anyone, especially Miss HOA Queen Bee, claim my farm for a wedding without so much as a friendly handshake or even a courtesy call. If she thought I was in a rollover like a docile sheep, she'd picked the wrong shepherd. I marched across the yard, my boots crunching over gravel. By the time I reached my porch steps, I'd already decided. If Karen was set on having her fancy wedding here, she was about to learn that a working farm isn't just a picturesque backdrop. It comes with critters, manure, and an owner who doesn't take kindly to trespassers. The day of the ceremony was shaping up to be quite an unforgettable event, one that just might involve a surprise cameo by my beloved goats. By Thursday morning, the gossip mill was already buzzing. My cousin Janelle, who lives 2 roads over, heard from a friend of a friend that an elegant country wedding was in full swing on my land. A few of my neighbors asked if I'd gone into the event business, worried I'd stop selling fresh eggs in favor of renting the fields out for big shindigs. Even my postal carrier, Ms. Dolores, took a moment to ask, "You hosting a wedding, honey?" as she handed over my mail. Clearly, Karen was telling everyone the farm was now a one-stop wedding wonderland. Me? I was feeling backed into a corner. The phone call started early. A local DJ wanting to confirm the best place to set up his speakers. A caterer looking to confirm the address for Saturday's delivery. It was chaos. But with each ring, I managed to hold my composure, telling them politely to coordinate with Karen, who apparently had all the answers. Meanwhile, I was busy planning my next move. Normally, I'm a mild person. I live by the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. But you don't go onto someone's property and orchestrate a 200-guest wedding without so much as a handshake. That's not just rude, it's downright brazen. So, with a tightness in my chest and more than a little excitement, I decided that if Karen insisted on hosting her event here, she'd do it under the full ambience of a functioning farm. I didn't have to sabotage anything outright. The goats and chickens could do that for me, if placed in the right situation. On Thursday afternoon, I spotted Karen strutting around the tent area again, barking instructions at a couple of men hammering stakes into the ground. She had a determined air, like a conductor leading an orchestra of hammered nails and table rentals. I ambled over, tipping my hat to the men as I passed. "Karen," I said, catching her eye, "we need to talk." She pursed her lips but nodded. "Make it quick," she said, flipping through a clipboard. I motioned to the men to give us a minute, and they stepped away. "Look, I never agreed to host this wedding. You didn't check with me first. I don't appreciate the intrusion." Karen let out a patronizing sigh. "Here we go again. It's for 1 day, and I've already put down non-refundable deposits on everything. Don't be difficult. It's not a big deal. This area is practically unused, and it's such a pretty setting. My niece has always loved it." "Unused, huh?" I clenched my jaw. "That in-use area is where I plan to expand my goat pen," I said. "Not to mention, it's in direct line of my irrigation system. If you drench the wedding party, that's on you. Are you sure you want to do this?" She shrugged, eyes drifting back to her clipboard. "We'll manage, and if anything goes wrong, we'll handle it like adults." "Funny you say that," I drawled, "because so far, you're not acting like one." Then, before she could protest, I pointed at the nearest table, stacked high with boxes of tablecloths. "Just remember, this is still my land, and I can't guarantee your perfect little ceremony will go off without a hitch. Farms are unpredictable places." I turned on my heel and walked away. My heart was pounding from the confrontation, but part of me felt an odd thrill. Normally, I avoided conflict with folks like Karen. They live for drama, relishing every chance to prove they were in the right. But my patience had a limit, and she bulldozed right over it. That evening, as the sun set over the barn, I fed the goats and mulled over my options. Was I truly prepared to let my animals run amok during the wedding? Could I find a less drastic solution? Maybe there was room for compromise. But every time I thought about them parading across my property unannounced, my blood boiled. The goats, sensing my agitation, nuzzled me for extra treats. Friday morning came, and the transformations on my land grew more elaborate. A dance floor was being installed. Fairy lights were strung between posts. A string quartet arrived for a rehearsal, their music drifting out across the fields. It might have been lovely under different circumstances, but it rankled me to see these strangers taking over without so much as a nod in my direction. I leaned against the fence, scanning the scene. Who said you could do that? I muttered under my breath as I watched them string lights across one of my old oak trees. Nobody responded. Of course, they were too busy flitting around, probably under direct orders from Karen. By late afternoon, the bride herself made an appearance. She looked sweet enough, all smiles and polite nods. She even approached me, slightly embarrassed, and explained that her Aunt Karen had arranged everything. She mentioned how grateful she was to have such a scenic place for her wedding. My anger softened slightly in the face of the young woman's genuine gratitude. It wasn't her fault she had a pushy aunt. At one point, she noticed my goats bleeding in their pen. "Oh, how adorable," she cooed, leaning over the fence with a big smile. "I love goats." Her fiancé was less enthusiastic, backing away when one of them let out a loud bleat. I gave a half-smile, torn between my annoyance at Karen and my sympathy for this unsuspecting bride. She clearly had no idea of the tension simmering underneath. "They're friendly," I said. "Don't mind the noise." She beamed, petting one of the goats that stuck its head through the fence. "I bet they could be a handful," she said. "Oh, you have no idea," I replied. I wanted to add something about how they'd look if they happened to crash a wedding buffet, but I held my tongue. She seemed too nice for that. When she walked away, I sighed. Part of me wanted to let them enjoy their day with no trouble. But then I spotted Karen in the distance, phone pressed to her ear, arms waving imperiously at a man on a ladder. She didn't even acknowledge me. I'd had enough. If Karen wanted to commandeer my property for a party, I was going to teach her that you can't just waltz into a farmer's life without consequences. I didn't need to sabotage the whole wedding. I just needed to remind them that in the country, nature and the creatures we care for come first. There's a reason we give a courtesy call, sign a waiver, or at least say please and thank you when we're on borrowed land. By the time Friday night rolled around, I had a plan. I let them start their wedding day as planned, all sunshine and daisies. But once they were in full swing, once the buffet was spread, the music was playing, and the guests were losing themselves in the celebration, I would open the gate and let the goats do what goats do best: explore, nibble, and create a bit of chaos in the process. Part of me worried that would ruin the bride's day. But maybe, I reasoned, I could aim for a well-timed fiasco that didn't involve the bride and groom directly, just the over-the-top buffet and decorations. Maybe it would even teach Karen a lesson about asking permission. It was far from a perfect plan, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction that curled in my chest at the thought. The wedding day dawned bright and warm, the kind of late spring Saturday that makes you want to kick off your shoes and run through the grass barefoot. By 8 in the morning, cars were rolling down my gravel driveway, despite my private property sign, carrying caterers, florists, and more. I eyed them from my porch, coffee cup in hand, feeling like a stranger in my own yard. A trio of vans unloaded large chafing dishes, portable heaters, and racks of succulent-looking food. I caught a whiff of roasted vegetables and herb-crusted chicken. My stomach rumbled a little, but I reminded myself that none of that was for me. Another truck arrived with crates of champagne. Meanwhile, staff in black slacks and crisp white shirts bustled around, setting tables with linen cloths, centerpieces, and place cards. Their efficiency was admirable. In under 2 hours, The place looked like a professional event venue with sparkling glassware, folded napkins, and delicate floral arrangements. Karen was in the thick of it, wearing a peach-colored sheath dress, her hair styled in a slick updo that defied the morning breeze. She strode across the makeshift aisle, directing people to their stations and scolding a delivery guy who knocked a flower arrangement off kilter. I watched her from a distance, making a mental note of the precise spot where the buffet would stand. It was a long table near the oak tree, loaded with covered trays and open platters. And behind that oak tree, on the other side of a small hill, was my goat pen. Around mid-morning, guests began arriving in their finery. Men in suits, women in dresses, a sprinkling of children tugging at their parents' sleeves. A gentle hum of conversation and laughter floated through the air. Cameras clicked as family members posed for group photos, the lush fields and rustic barn providing a charming backdrop. A quartet played soft classical tunes, adding an air of genteel elegance. I had to admit, it looked picturesque like a scene from a magazine. The bride, Meredith, arrived last. She wore a flowing gown that shimmered in the sunlight. Her face glowed with excitement and just a hint of nervousness. A small part of me felt guilty again. She seemed genuinely sweet, a stark contrast to her aunt. I didn't want to ruin her special day, but my frustration with Karen still gnawed at me like a splinter. The ceremony began at noon, with the officiant calling everyone to take their seats. Karen rushed around, hushing people and ushering them into rows of chairs. I stayed off to the side by the old tractor near the barn, watching from a distance. The officiant spoke in warm, practiced tones, reciting vows about love, partnership, and respect. My mouth twitched at that particular word. When the bride and groom exchanged rings, the crowd erupted in applause. As the couple sealed their vows with a kiss, even I found myself clapping quietly. The bride's smile could have powered the entire farm's electricity for a week. She looked that happy. For a moment, I almost abandoned my plan. But then Karen stepped up, pride oozing from her pores, and started ordering everyone around again. Family photos over here, guests to the appetizer table. No, that's not the correct seat. The arrogance in her tone rekindled my resentment. She hadn't once bothered to speak to me that morning. No greeting, no thanks, nothing. If she wanted to pretend my farm was her personal domain, she was about to learn a valuable lesson about the unpredictability of farmland. The reception slid smoothly into full swing. The quartet switched to livelier tunes, the newlyweds took to the dance floor, and the aroma of the catered feast wafted temptingly. I saw guests wander toward the buffet, plates in hand. Long tables were laden with grilled vegetables, carved meat, fresh bread rolls, and a chocolate fountain. Another side table held the wedding cake, a tiered confection of white frosting and pink sugar flowers. It was all so elaborate, you'd think they were hosting a celebrity gala. I slipped away, quiet as a barn cat, and made my way around the back of the oak tree. From there, it was just a short walk to the goat pen. I peered inside to find my goats lazing around, half dozing in the warm sun. They perked up when they saw me, expecting a treat. I ran my hand over Daisy's back, then Bernice's, then scratched the big billy goat. "You're up, gang," I whispered. Earlier, I'd loosened a few fence boards that led out into the clearing near the oak. All I had to do was swing it open, and my goats would be free to roam. Normally, I kept them pinned to prevent them from munching on my vegetable garden or wandering onto the road. But today was different. I took a deep breath, imagining the scene that would follow. Would it be too cruel? The bride might cry, the groom might be furious, and Karen, well, she deserved a taste of humble pie. I unhooked the latch, the board swung aside, and the goats trotted out, curious snouts raised to the air. They weren't stampeding or anything so dramatic. Goats are more inquisitive than destructive at first. But the moment they caught the smell of fresh food, that succulent buffet, they started off in that direction with an eagerness that was almost comical. I followed at a distance, heart hammering in my chest. My mind skittered between excitement and dread. Maybe they'd just sniff around the tablecloths and glean a few scraps. Or maybe, well, I had a feeling it wouldn't be so neat. I didn't have to wonder for long. Within minutes, the goats found their way to the buffet. One hopped onto the edge of the table with surprising agility, making the whole setup rattle. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests as Bernice began nibbling at a flower arrangement. Another goat stuck its head into a chafing dish, rummaging for something tasty. Several guests yelped and backed away, while a few children squealed in delight, pointing and laughing. Chaos ensued. Caterers rushed to shoo the goats away, but goats are nothing if not stubborn. Daisy started licking the chocolate fountain. Yes, you read that right. And ended up with globs of melted chocolate all over her muzzle. Scratch, the billy goat, discovered a stack of bread rolls and began gulping them down. Someone shrieked, "They're eating the wedding food." I hung back, feigning innocence, and watched the scene unfold in breathless fascination. Guests scrambled to salvage plates of fancy appetizers, while the goats dashed from platter to platter, unstoppable in their quest for culinary adventure. The bride, who'd been in conversation with a friend, froze with wide eyes. The groom looked equally stunned. Then, to my surprise, they started laughing, tentatively at first, but soon joined by a few amused onlookers. Karen, on the other hand, was positively livid. Her face turned a shade of red I've only seen on ripe tomatoes. She stomped toward the goats, waving her arms and shrieking, "Get out of here! Shoo! Someone do something!" She shot me a furious glare, but I just shrugged as if to say, "They're goats. Good luck." In the swirl of activity, waiters shouting, guests shrieking, cameras clicking, it occurred to me that this was indeed the most memorable wedding the farm had ever seen. And whether or not that was a good thing depended entirely on who you asked. Amid the pandemonium, I took a moment to appreciate how the bride and groom handled the chaos. After their initial shock, they seemed more entertained than anything. The bride, careful not to dirty her dress, actually moved closer to the goats, giggling as one nibbled a discarded napkin. The groom gently pried a piece of bread from a goat's mouth, apologizing profusely to the caterers. Meanwhile, Karen bellowed orders like a panicked general on a battlefield. "Get those animals out of here," she screeched, pointing at me with an accusatory finger. "Can't you control your livestock?" "Last I checked," I replied coolly, "you didn't ask my permission to host a wedding here. They're just doing what goats do on my land." Her jaw dropped. For a moment, she looked completely flabbergasted. Then she let loose a string of indignant words about lawsuits and property rights, how I'd ruined her niece's wedding, and how the entire HOA would be hearing about this. If her words were paint, she was splattering them all over me in broad, angry strokes. At that very moment, the bride stepped in. Her cheeks were flushed, and her hair was starting to come loose from the pins. But she wore a smile that wavered between exasperation and amusement. "Aunt Karen," she said gently, "please calm down. This is actually kind of funny. Everyone will remember our wedding for sure." She turned to me with an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry if we've caused any trouble. We didn't realize you hadn't given permission." I nodded, feeling a flicker of warmth for the bride's understanding attitude. "I understand, and I'm sorry if the goats frightened anyone. But you have to see this from my perspective. I can't just have random people taking over the property I live and work on." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the bride held up a hand, a surprising gesture of authority. "Aunt Karen, you told me this was all arranged and approved. I asked you multiple times, and you insisted everything was fine." She glanced at me. "We never meant to barge in uninvited." I gave a small shrug. "Well, that's what happened. And let's be honest, your aunt is known for, pushing the boundaries." The tension in the air was thick enough to slice with a butter knife. A few goats continued to wander among the tables, nibbling at bits of food that had fallen onto the grass. The caterers were trying to salvage what they could, but the buffet was undeniably goat-tasted. Some guests looked annoyed, others amused, and a good handful recorded the spectacle on their phones. Finally, Karen deflated a bit under her niece's scrutinizing gaze. I may have glossed over a few details," she admitted grudgingly. "But I was certain he wouldn't mind. It's just a big field. I've had my eye on it for events like this." The bride shot her a disappointed look. "Aunt Karen, It's not your property. You can't just assume. Karen huffed, glaring daggers at me, as though I'd orchestrated the whole fiasco out of pure spite. Which in some ways I had, but I felt justified. I folded my arms. Listen, I said, addressing the bride and groom. If you folks still want to celebrate, I'm not going to run you off. But you'll have to accept that this is a working farm. I'll help gather the goats, try to keep them pinned, but you've got to understand that you're here on my terms. The bride looked at her groom, who gave a small nod and squeezed her hand. Then she turned back to me with a grateful smile. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. And again, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding. We should have made sure everything was clear with you directly. Karen inhaled as if to protest, but the groom fixed her with a calm, yet firm stare. It was clear he wasn't pleased with how Karen had handled things. She snapped her mouth shut. With the bride's blessing, I managed to corral the goats. A few guests joined in, awkwardly herding the animals back toward the pen, giggling at the chocolate stains on Daisy's muzzle. Karen still muttered under her breath, but she kept her distance. Once the animals were secured, the caterers hastily rearranged what was left of the buffet, salvaging unnibbled platters and repositioning them on fresh tablecloths. Amazingly, the party resumed. The band struck up a lively tune, the guests refilled their glasses, and the laughter started to bubble up again. People swapped stories about the goat invasion, some turning it into a comedic anecdote to break the ice. I even overheard one of the ushers say, "Man, you can't script this kind of entertainment." The bride and groom shared their first dance, stepping carefully around patches of grass that might have fallen goat droppings. It was surreal, but somehow it worked. I stayed on the sidelines for most of it, though I did accept an offer of a piece of cake. Turns out the goats hadn't gotten to it yet. It was fluffy and sweet, far better than anything I usually whip up in my old farmhouse kitchen. Watching everyone mingle, I realized that even though Karen's audacity had inflamed my temper, the rest of her family seemed decent enough. Maybe, just maybe, they'd leave with a good story rather than a deep grudge. Eventually, the time came for speeches. Karen stepped up to the microphone, looking flustered but determined. "I want to apologize," she began, clearing her throat, "for the unexpected interruptions earlier. This day was meant to be perfect for my niece and her husband, and despite some hiccups, she gave me a fleeting glance. We made it through. Congratulations, Meredith and Charles. May your marriage be as, resilient as your reception." A ripple of polite applause followed. Then the bride and groom shared their thanks, praising the guests for their good humor. The bride, bright-eyed, took the mic. "You know, I always dreamed of a memorable wedding day, and I got it. Thanks to some very curious goats, a wonderful groom, and an enthusiastic aunt." The crowd chuckled. She turned to me and raised her glass. "And special thanks to our unexpected host for letting us stay, even under unusual circumstances." I nodded, managing a wry smile. Something about her speech took the sting out of the situation. Maybe I'd been too harsh, or maybe it was just a measure of justice that Karen didn't get away scot-free. As the sun began to dip in the sky, the guests trickled out, hugging and taking photos by the barn. The newlyweds made their grand exit in a shower of biodegradable confetti, because Karen insisted on being environmentally conscious in every other aspect, ironically enough. At last, the only people remaining were the cleanup crew, Karen and me. Karen approached, tension clinging to her posture. "Look," she said, pursing her lips, "I'll pay for any damages. I'm not out to rip you off. I just thought it would be nice for Meredith." I regarded her a moment. "Damages aren't the point," I answered. "But yes, you should pay for anything that got broken or messed up. More importantly, you should have asked." She exhaled, crossing her arms. "I sent an email," she insisted weakly, then caught herself. "All right, you're right. I should have made absolutely sure. This won't happen again." I almost laughed at the understatement. "You can count on that." We parted ways with a curt nod. Karen's shoulders slumped as she got into her SUV and drove away. I watched until the dust of the driveway settled, feeling a complex swirl of vindication, relief, and a strange hint of pity for her. Once everyone was gone, I trudged back into the field. It was littered with confetti, trampled grass, and a few empty cups. My goats poked their heads over the fence, bleating and greeting. I patted Daisy, grateful she'd stopped short of devouring the entire buffet. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, letting the crickets serenade me while I replayed the day's events in my mind. It was messy and a bit cruel, but I had to admit it was also fitting. Karen waltzed in thinking she could bend a working farm to her will, only to discover that nature and a stubborn farmer had other plans. Perhaps, in a twisted way, the goat fiasco was exactly what everyone needed: a lesson in humility, communication, and respect. I wasn't sure what stories would circulate among the HOA after this, but for once, I didn't care. Life on the farm would continue as it always had, with goats to feed, fields to tend, and an owner who didn't yield to intimidation. And if Karen or anyone else dared to plan another unapproved event on my property, well, I had a pen of four-legged party crashers ready and waiting to greet them, this time with an even bigger appetite. The end.